Hey guys, this is Mr. Naimatsu. Just trying to give you a little idea of what to do for units 4.2 and 4, or sorry, 4.3 and 4.4. So first, before we kind of go into the concept outline, let me just go ahead and give you guys an overview. 4.2 and 4.4 is really what's happening. Actually, sorry, again, 4.3 and 4.4. 4.3 is really a focus on what's happening after 1945, basically after World War II, regarding to the society, the intellect, and the culture of Europe. I'm not going to go too much into those because, quite honestly, it is so varied and so all over the place that I don't think it's really worth your time. I am going to review a couple ideas and kind of talk about a couple moments, but again, I'm not going to go too into 4.3. 4.4, I think, has a better chance of being on the test. This is really about immigration, decolonization, and the idea of European unity and going close to what we call the European Union and the EU. Europe makes some financial steps to unify its country using the what we call the EU, the European Union, which created the euro, which is their common currency that all of Europe uses today, except for England, which just came out of the Brexit. Actually, never used the euro; is always using the pound. But recently, we've had a bunch of European leaders actually calling to get out of the European Union. Saying that perhaps the European Union and its kind of common currency is not really benefiting them nearly as much. So I'm going to go a little bit further into European unity, the European Union, and the EU, which really develops obviously after the Cold War in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, or officially in 1991. All right, so before we get into the details, let's go to 4.3. I'm going to use the concept outline right here to go ahead and show you some items and kind of talk about some things. All right, so going down to 4.3, we have intellect and culture. Obviously, you guys have noticed that kind of focusing on this introduction at the very beginning has been quite helpful. And you're going to find a lot of answers in there. Again, here is some information about the Newtonian universe and, using Wikipedia, using your review book, using also the history sage notes, which I'm going to actually use for the European Union idea. You should have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So I'll go through each one of these, kind of talk about what this question is asking and help you guys understand. So the widely held belief in progress, characteristic of much 19th century thought, began to break down before World War I. The experience of war intensified the sense of anxiety and permeated many facets of culture, giving way by the century's end to a plurality of intellectual frameworks. Basically, World War I is kind of the idea of it was a kind of the idea of certainty that we knew things were happening. They knew it was going to be a swift, quick war. But when World War I didn't, it actually added the age of anxiety. And when you're anxious, you don't know what's going to go on. So theories of and psychology come out. Probably the most important person you want to know is Freud. Freud is a modern psychologist. He comes up with our idea of dreams and the subconscious and those type of ideas. So one person you want to look right here would be Freud. The effects of World War and economic depression undermine this confidence in science and human reasoning, giving emphasis to existentialism and producing postmodernism in the post-1945 period. Existentialism is a belief that I exist right now as I am, and my focus is here. It's kind of almost like humanism, really with humanism with a severe amount of secularism in there, if that makes sense. It is basically the focus on your pure existence as it is right now. The famous existentialist, I actually know the transcendentalist, but if you Google existentialist, I'm sure you have a quick idea of what's going on. Next, there are focuses on the Newtonian universe. We start getting ideas from Einstein about the idea of different phases of the universe and things that we may not be able to see or identify, like different dimensions, and also how the focus on the universe, especially the focus on atoms and minute focus on nuclear weapons of power. So here are some people here that you can look up to help you guys out. Medical theories and technologies extend life but pose social and moral questions. So they began focusing on things and also has some religious, political, philosophical perspectives. Eugenics is the study of genes and the use of genes to go ahead and probably help make the best person. So we could see this as clones. This is actually created in World War II underneath Hitler. The study of, he actually kind of created modern eugenics. Him and his Nazi party would actually conduct science experiments on their Jewish prisoners. For instance, would a Jewish person or a Jewish woman compared to a man, after being dunked between hot water and cold water, how long would they survive? I mean, some really cruel stuff. But the really focus was on races and categorizing races. And the word eugenics actually has the word genes in there. So hopefully it'll give you an idea. Birth control, we know, is a major issue. It's obviously a very social issue, as well as abortion. I mean, we're still having those fights here within the United States today. Fertility treatments, women that cannot have children, actually having what we call a test tube baby, where the baby is actually fertilized inside a test tube and then put back into the women in their uterus. Genetic engineering, cloning, all those type of things. Military technologies to make possible industrialized warfare, genocide, nuclear proliferation, the risk of global or nuclear war. That's kind of more of the Cold War. Let's see here. This is it's a focus more on religion. So we're going to kind of focus on the religion. Again, this is totalitarianism. So this is a more of a focus on World War II, and also the Cold War. Here are some people that you might want to look at. Pope John Paul II is a guy that kind of goes to the Cold War countries that are being owned by the Soviet Union and says, you know what, let these countries be free. And he kind of pushes this. There's a big moment in Poland, if you might want to look at that. Reforming the Catholic Church found expression in the Second Vatican Council, which redefined the Church's dogma and practice and started to redefine its relationship with other religious communities. Again, I'd probably look at the Second Vatican Council. This is definitely in your review book, the APA, so you could do a quick little paragraph on that one. Increased immigration. We know this is one of the major issues that's happening, especially due to the Syria crisis. We know that because of the Syrian civil war, that we've had waves of Syrian immigrants come over to Europe. So you're beginning to see this issue. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of Eastern Europeans started going over to Western countries. One of the most famous would be the Romas, also called the Romanians. In Europe, they call them the Gypsies, but you had a lot of that. Also, a lot of North African people from Morocco, from Egypt, from all of these areas, started to want to immigrate over towards Italy and use that as basically a ramp to get into the heart of Europe, get to Germany and gets to France and England and Switzerland, where things seems to be a little bit safer and seems more economic opportunities. France just reelected a president who is going to kind of focus on immigration, but not try to stop immigrants from coming in. The person going against it wanted to pull out of the European Union, wanted to stop immigration, wanted to basically let Syria do its own thing. So we can see these fights are happening presently. We can see it very clearly. Lastly, this is just too much, in my opinion. These are all the different types of arts and architecture and music that went down. So you can check out any of these, but I'm not going to take my time today to talk about all these little things. Also, these are different writers. One of the most famous would be probably Kafka and James Joyce. I read both of these in high school. Sartre made a book called No Exit, where he describes hell as a place where you're in basically a hotel room and you're stuck with 4 people for the rest of your life. You may love them, you may hate them, but basically you're stuck there. And that basically kind of focuses on his idea of existentialism, like how we exist now. And he basically is making the argument that hell is here on earth because we're surrounded by people and we have to deal with them. So it's kind of some interesting stuff, but really heavy, kind of almost senior level literature. And I'm not going to give you guys I'm not going to make you guys read an entire book to understand these guys' ideas. Lastly, increased imports of United States technology and popular culture. Coca-Cola would be probably the fastest, the best. Now we have the internet, but it created enthusiasm and criticism, as Coca-Cola started replacing, let's say, French iced tea, does French iced tea go away? So this is the idea of what's called globalization, the idea that things are moving faster. And as things move around the world, like Coca-Cola or McDonald's, do they start replacing some of the things that are important to that culture? For instance, if we go to India, instead of seeing some nice, beautiful curry on rice, are we going to see people having a double, a quarter pounder with cheese from McDonald's? Or KFC is all over the place, or Taco Bell or Starbucks is another example. Will the Italian coffee companies get slowly replaced by Starbucks, which is this American style of coffee. So hopefully that gives you guys a couple ideas of what's going on. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and switch over. We're going to go to our TAC websites, and on our TAC websites, I'm going to show you guys how to use to focus on European unity. I'm going to give you a quick lecture using the history stage notes and kind of point to a couple things on the history stage notes that might help you out. So I've added 2 tags here. Mr. Procopio has as well. I'm going to click the one that says decolonization, immigration. By the way, the history stage notes are exactly the same for modern intellect and culture, and also decolonization, immigration, and European unity. They're both called economic recovery and unity, according to this guy, Mr. Mercado, who creates these history stage notes. So I'm going to scroll down here. This gives you information from about 1945 into the Cold War. So this is all kind of Cold War stuff that's happening here. But I'm going to go down to where we start getting to the EU and start talking about the EU. Here it talks about the welfare state. I know that was one of the questions that you'll see, is that, as the people began questioning what we call the welfare state, as European countries became pretty much socialist at certain levels. They began taxing very highly in order to give their people services such as Social Security and free healthcare, which we are debating now again in our country. You can see here that it says high taxes on wealthier citizens to provide those to all. So again, I think there's a lot of really good information here that can go ahead and that can give you a lot of information for those essential questions. Another idea is the idea of guest workers. We have those inside here. Donald Trump has just attacked this program. It's called I think it's H1B1 visa program or something like that. H1B1. I don't know what the actual initials are, but it's basically a program in which we are saying, you know what, we don't have enough Americans that have the skills for these jobs. So we've been basically encouraging Indian and Chinese workers to immigrate to the United States, and we would give them basically a quick visa, and this visa would give them permission to come to the United States and become a worker. Well, in Europe we call them a guest worker. So the reason here is, again, it says there's low birth rate. There may not be enough workers. And so we got immigrants, here we go again, from the Eastern Europe. Again, if you look at these, this is all people that came from the Soviet Union. Actually, not the Soviet Union, but the USSR. Remember, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. These were countries that were basically taken over and turned into puppets by the Soviet Union. And if you don't understand the Cold War, it's super important that you do. So there is a little screencast just like this one. It's about 40 minutes for the Cold War. If you want to go back to the TAC website, I really recommend that you do. Here are those North Africans that I was talking about. Again, these are what we consider very dark-skinned Africans here, but they're coming over here to go ahead and get opportunities for economic and political stability, obviously. So here you can see all these immigration issues, but I'm really going to focus on the European unity. So right now, after the Cold War, basically, there is no reason that Europe should be divided between East and West. And again, I'm going to say this one last time. If you have no idea what the heck the Cold War is, you should definitely check out my TAC website. Also, on the Cold War TAC website, I just added a quick Cold War, I think, in 9 minutes or something like that, or something that you might want to check out. It has over 2 million views on YouTube, so it seems like it's pretty good. But anyways, after the Cold War, there was really no reason to have a division between Europe. And so the idea of Europe is like, hey, if we begin trading, allowing our people to move, allow people to go from one country to another, not necessarily to stay there and immigrate, but to go ahead and visit so that they can spend money as tourists, hey, this is a positive thing. And one of the biggest sources of income in Europe was actually tourism. If you think about Europe, and I'm sure you've said it in your brain a million times, oh, I want to go to Paris, I want to go to London, I'd love to see Barcelona. And, the reason why I only went to Europe was not just to go ahead and have a job or anything. I actually went there as a tourist every single time to learn about the area. So because of that, when you had different types of currencies and every time you would leave a country, you'd have to go through immigration, this caused some major issues for tourism. And it kind of limited people like me from spending money in other countries. Or maybe, when I take my trip, I'm just going to stay in Spain because I'd rather not change my money from Spanish money to French money, then to English money. And then each time that I go have to deal with immigration and looking at my passport and stamping things and yada, 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 yada. So the idea was this is to make kind of like a mini United States of Europe, where each country would have its own kind of ideas and do its own things, but it would have a kind of common political and economic framework to work with. And this is what's causing some issues. It's how much do the countries of Europe want their independence and not be dominated by this transnational, this supranational government that's kind of called the European Union. All right. Well, it first starts through a series of developments. So the first one is the Council of Europe. This idea is just a political idea. But as you guys have noticed, whether we talk about the unification of Germany through Prussia or the unification of all these different countries, usually it starts with economics. If you can unify the country through free trade, through a common currency, through a common language, then politically you can begin focusing. So the first one, the Council of Europe, this is kind of creating a parliament. They wanted to create a government, but it failed kind of miserably. This kind of took off a little bit better, the European Coal and Steel Community. And again, this is in 1950. Remember that this is in response to the Soviet Union. And these countries all basically decide to go ahead and create coal and steel and have it freely moved between everybody. And so these 6 countries basically began to form a economic relationship. Later it'll become the 6. All right. So because of this, they began going, well, we need to create a common market, a way in which we can control prices and goods. And they began to go ahead and become members of that. And again, they began to reduce all tariffs. They began to say free trade, and they began limiting these barriers between countries. All right. So all of those happen, and its focus continues to have political and economic union. Now, again, there are some issues that are going to happen. France withdraws from NATO, which was against the Soviet Union. So not everybody is trying to unify completely. We have some issues with France multiple times. He goes against basically the United States in our idea of unifying Europe through NATO. So later in 1992, officially, we create the EU. And in the EU, they say, you know what? We should create a European currency and a common defense and common foreign policy. And that was the idea that together we would, Europe would go ahead and address some of these issues. So I'll give you an example. With the Syria crisis, basically the EU came together and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to give a lot of money to Greece and a lot of money to Turkey to make sure they stop the immigrants from coming up to the rest of Europe. So that's kind of their idea of a common defense, is that kind of looking around, take a look at the states and figure out what's going on. The EU has basically made a common defense against Russia, because Russia currently is kind of going into Eastern Europe and has been it took back Crimea, and it's kind of focusing on Ukraine right now. So Ukraine is still kind of a major issue over there. So in this example, they basically have told Poland, hey, Poland, heads up, we're going to be sending some army over there to protect you against Russia in case Russia gets a little crazy. So you can see that they make these steps towards it. Probably the most important thing was the creation of the euro dollar, or the euro. It has for 12 of the different European nations. Remember that Britain never would be in the euro. They always wanted the pound. And when I went there recently, the pound was always more expensive than the euro. So always things in England were a lot more expensive, unfortunately. And we know that if you want to add some synthesis, we know that in our last election, less than a year ago, the leader of Britain basically said, I am going to leave the euro, called Brexit. And just yesterday being May 7th, 2017, we just had a French president who was running against another candidate. The guy who won said, you know what, we're going to stay in the EU, but he was running against a lady that was saying, we're going to remove ourselves from the EU, from the European Union. We are paying way too much money to this government. It's not doing anything. It's not helping us. Syrian refugees, and they would call it terrorism. Some people would say Islamic terrorism, but they would say terrorism continues to come into our country. Why are we spending all this money, spending all this time for a European Union that really doesn't help us? So that's kind of an idea there too. Um, Anyway, so it keeps on going with the EU and the European community, and that's pretty much where I'm going to stop that about the EU. You know, it starts with a kind of a economic deal with the European coal and steel community, and after that, more and more states kind of see the benefits of having reduced taxes, allowing free trade, and having a common currency. Also, reducing barriers to migration, whether that be tourists or actual European citizens going from one country to another to find a better job. So they said all these things, you know, were kind of good things, but we're starting to see some countries question that and actually react by withdrawing themselves from the European Union. Again, the example, most recent example would be England or Britain in what they called the Brexit vote, Brexit, Brexit, where they're exiting the European Union. Britain was exiting the European Union. It's called Brexit, kind of a major issue that happened this summer. So anyways, hopefully that gives you guys a little bit better idea. Again, seeing a lot of great notes on these history stage notes. So if anything, I would use those. All right, good luck. Test is coming up quick. Study hard.